Asking me about tradition means that I want to look at tradition from two different directions. If one thinks about artistic tradition, the way previous painters in France had painted landscape, because Monet was essentially a landscape painter, really Monet didn't engage with tradition very much at all. There was a long-standing tradition going back to the 17th century, to landscape painters like Nicolas Poussin, Claude Lorrain, and Monet was not interested in their work at all, in the sense that it was a very ordered, structured kind of landscape, revived around 1800, carried on into the 19th century by people like Corot. And Monet wasn't interested in that sort of landscape painting. He was interested in direct observation. He looked back to painters of the previous generation like Théodore Rousseau, for example, or Courbet. But that was something fairly modern, something very direct, and didn't really involve ideas of tradition very much. But I think an aspect of the tradition in France that was more important for Monet was the picturesque. And that was something that had developed in the 1820s. After the collapse of the Napoleonic Empire in 1815 with the Battle of Waterloo, the idea of France as being imperial, which Napoleon had tried to promote as emperor, with an emphasis on classical architecture and so on, disappeared. And the restoration of the monarchy, looking back to the Middle Ages and the support of the church as the strength of the monarchy, made French culture turn back to the Middle Ages and to older periods. And the idea of the picturesque was borrowed by the French from the English. People like Payne Knight, Richard Payne Knight in Britain, and Uvedale Price had developed the idea of the picturesque, looking back to often medieval and old buildings and structures, even ones that were in ruins, and saying these have a beauty of their own. And that was looking at national culture rather than something imperial and borrowed from ancient Rome. And so the picturesque, which became very important from the 1820s, with albums produced, with texts describing these old buildings, illustrated with the modern medium of lithograph, these became increasingly important in French culture, describing old buildings and enthusing people about them, encouraging them to be visited. And of course the development of new technologies like the railway system in France that started in 1843 encouraged people with its guidebooks to travel to see these great buildings of France. And Monet grew up, born in 1840, with that pittoresque culture. And when we look at his early paintings, paintings of the 1860s, painted when he was in his 20s, he would paint somewhere like the port of Honfleur on the Channel coast. And yes, he was interested in the port and the modern ships coming into it, but he was also interested in the old buildings, like the Lieutenance, the house built for the lieutenant of the king, which he painted twice, for example, in 1864. And this was a very old building which actually had its foundations in the medieval walls of a very ancient building, and that had been built on in the 16th and 17th and 18th centuries, a building that had gradually changed with the ages as its purposes changed. Monet painted it twice because it was pittoresque. So that sense of tradition is something that I think was very important for Monet. And when he arrived in Vétheuil in 1878, a village about 60 kilometers to the northwest of Paris, the first thing he did was paint the parish church. And he painted it twice, and he painted the facade. It was a medieval church, but it had had a very interesting Western facade put on it at the end of the 16th century. A Renaissance facade, and Monet painted it, as I say, twice, because it was a building that was registered by the French historical monuments, something set up in the 1830s, again to respond to the pittoresque, and had been illustrated in pittoresque albums. So Monet was really quite consistently interested in the picturesque and that aspect of French tradition. Place was extremely important to Monet. Places attracted him, sometimes by accident, sometimes by a sense of competitiveness, other times by a desire to experiment. So, for example, when he fled Paris at the time of the Franco-Prussian War towards the end of 1870 and went to London, he didn't expect to be in London. But he was fascinated by the city and painted it and chose particular parts of London to paint, particularly the docks, very busy, modern and industrial, and the parks, the rather unstructured parks that we have in London compared to the very ordered parks that he'd have been used to in Paris. He wanted to go back to London, which he by then knew, in the 1880s and the 1890s, but didn't manage to do so until 1899. Then when he went back, he discovered another London, an older artist with different aesthetic priorities, a richer artist able to stay at the Savoy Hotel, the lucky man. He was fascinated by other things. He did not paint the parks of London again, nor did he even paint the docks. He remained interested in modernity, but not because of the busy ships and barges and tugboats and factory chimneys of the docks, but because from the Savoy Hotel, he could look across the river to the south bank of the Thames, which had a lot of factories in it that spewed out smoke, which is polluted. And all the coal-fired chimneys of people's houses sent up a lot of smoke into the sky. London could be very misty anyway, but that, mixed with the pollution, gave a fog that changed colour a great deal. So Monet's letters from the Savoy say, "This morning it was blue." No, it wouldn't have said it was blue. No, I get that wrong. "This morning it was yellow, and then it went green." So he was really excited by the changing colours. And when you look at the pictures, you don't think of modernity, but the modernity was inherent in the ghastly pollution, which fascinated him because of its colours. So there you get a sense of the artist responding to place, but for different reasons. Sometimes when he lived in a place for some time, he sucked the place dry. So he moved to Vétheuil, just outside Paris, about 60 kilometres outside Paris, in 1878, and left in 1881. And in that period of only about 3.5 years, he had really painted everything there was to paint there. And so he felt he had to move. He then moved very briefly to another French village on the Seine, Poissy, which he didn't like painting at all. So he moved on again, and he moved to Giverny. And when he settled in Giverny in 1883, one can argue that he painted the landscape of Giverny, around Giverny, for a number of years. But certainly within a decade, he more or less exhausted that too. And that's one of the reasons why he developed his garden and had the water lily ponds dug and so on, because the nature surrounding his house at Giverny had gone dead for him. So he needed to create an artificial nature in his garden to fascinate him. So he made his own place. So Monet's attitude to place was crucial to him, but constantly changing. In the end, the most important place for Monet was his garden at Giverny, because he had painted there for so many years, for several decades before his death in 1926. And so Giverny was where Monet finally put down his roots, and it became the place that fascinated him because he'd made it for himself. But there were other places that fascinated him too on a temporary basis. And that was because he was challenging himself. So for example, when he first went to work on the Mediterranean, just across the Italian border in Bordighera in 1884, that was to paint the light of the Mediterranean for the first time, and at least on a consistent basis. And that was something that was him saying, can I do it? I want to take the risk. I want to push myself. And so he stayed in Bordighera for a couple of months and produced a marvellous group of paintings of the bright sunlight, the sea, as reflecting the Mediterranean sun, and so on, and a completely different type of building, different foliage, different trees, and so on, which was different for him. So he was an artist who liked to challenge himself, and places gave him that sort of stimulus. He went to the Mediterranean to paint a campaign for the first time in 1884. 2 years later, he worked on Belle-Île, an island in the Atlantic off the south coast of Brittany, and that was completely different. Belle-Île is so swept by the wind coming in off the Atlantic Ocean. It has waves crashing against it. It hardly has any trees on its very flat surface, and it has great cliffs leading down towards the ocean. Monet didn't paint on the beach, dangerous there, but he painted on the cliffs, looking down at the waves breaking on the rocks, where the rocks had been smashed up, leaving great pinnacles there of schist, of the kind of rock they have there. And he was fascinated by the kind of landscape he'd never seen before. He painted the sea frequently in the English Channel, La Manche as the French call it, but that's not the same as the Atlantic Ocean. So again, he was stimulated by something that was different and was going to challenge him. So moving to another place, even if it was temporarily for 2 or 3 months, was something that as an artist he enjoyed, because he was competitive not only with other artists, but with himself. One thing that is interesting about Monet is his attitude to modernity. Many people think that modernity is absolutely central to Impressionism, and indeed it is, but we need to moderate that with other currents. I've already talked about how the picturesque was something that in the 1860s, in the 1870s, into the 1880s interested Monet, was part of his way of seeing. And it's interesting when we look at modernity that we can find the way that it affected his sense of place changed. In the 1860s, as a young artist in his 20s, Monet sometimes painted modern subjects, the port of Le Havre, for example. Occasionally, views of central Paris with the Seine flowing through and steamboats on the Seine and the traffic passing on the quay. But there was a combination of subjects that he painted at those times. In the 1870s, in his 30s, when he was living in Argenteuil, one of the outer suburbs of Paris, then he concentrated more on modern subjects. That culminated in 1877 when he painted a number of very important pictures of the Gare Saint-Lazare, one of Paris's central railway stations. And there was nothing more modern than a railway station at that time. It was to do with crowds of people moving to and fro, a sense of speed, the momentum of the modern, completely new structured buildings made of glass and iron. Those were very deliberately modern pictures as a group. But within a very few years of that, only a couple of years afterwards, he'd really abandoned modern subjects and had gone over to painting landscape. Sometimes the villages to the north of France where he lived, places like Vétheuil and later Giverny. But also in 1889, he travelled to the Creuse Valley, right in central France, which is incredibly remote. And when he was there, he barely, in the 30 or 40 odd paintings he made, he hardly painted a building. There are a few pictures of a watermill in the distance. Many of the pictures are just completely wild landscapes with a river which had run a gorge through the mountains, or through the hillsides rather, they're not mountains, through the hillsides over centuries, an unchanged landscape. And that's what fascinated him, because it was an ancient landscape geologically, but it changed constantly in the light. That fascinated him, and there was nothing modern about it. So the modern and modern places moved in and out of Monet's work. When he was back in London around 1900, there's a sense of the modern. He was in the middle of what was then the world's greatest city. But often he was not interested in the most emphatically modern parts of London, like the docks, like the factories. And when he did paint things like the factories, they're veiled in fog. Now, that's the fog of pollution, which is modern, but actually he was really interested in it, one could say, not because of its modernity, but because of the haze it gave, softening the forms and the colours that played on it. And that's what fascinated his artist's eye.